What exactly is the problem we're trying to solve today, Scott?
So when we left things off in our last video, we'd done our domain storytelling picture, which you can see here presented on my screen to the right. And we kind of got to the end and we're like, this is great. We have a shared understanding of the domain. But then if you think a bit further down the road and you want to actually build a system in this fashion, we're not quite at the level of detail where we can go off and work independently of each other yet, right? Like we don't really have a shared understanding of the APIs between the domain components. We kind of know what the domain components roughly are, but we don't know exactly how they're going to talk to each other. And at that point, we said, hey, we know this other technique, event storming. Maybe this is something that we should use here to drive out the next level of detail. And I know you're personally very interested in it, so it's probably a good opportunity to do that.
Yeah. So event storming, for anyone who's not familiar, is this idea that was popularized by Alberto Brandolini, who is this lovely fellow you can see here. And if we quote things directly from the website, because the website describes what it is pretty well, and it's this idea of being the smartest approach to collaboration beyond siloed boundaries, which sounds kind of like what we're kind of needing here. And if you scroll down to the bottom here, there's some places where event storming is really useful. So to assess health of existing businesses is kind of not really us. We're not really existing. Explore the viability of startup business models to envisage new services, sounding more like what we might need. And then this last one here is the one that, at least if we're talking about event-driven architecture, is the one that I always found really useful, is the design clean and maintainable event-driven software to support rapidly evolving businesses, which is kind of what I'll expect will be, right?
Yeah, I'd say so. It's a good way of kind of front loading the thought about the design and the architecture. And even if it's not as necessary as it would be in like a much larger team with many more people trying to collaborate
Yeah.
effectively from the start, I think it's still a good exercise.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's two things to point out that are really important right at the start. Like, although we both have maybe a preference, if you will, for like a building event-driven systems or prioritizing asynchronous communication, it's always really important to point out that like event storming, although it is about events and business events, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to then go on and build a fully event-driven system. Like if you're building a monolith, single process, it still can be something that's really useful to like tease out the business ideas, which leads on to the second really important thing to always point out is that this should always be a non-technical conversation. So although me and you are both technical, if we were doing this in the real world, we would have, business analysts, stakeholders, people who know the business, wouldn't necessarily be a technical conversation. So we're kind of both going to have to take off our developer hats just for a minute and throw them to one side while we work through this today. The general idea of doing an event storm, you can do this virtually, you can do it in person. And what you typically do when you do an event storm is you've got three different types of messages, if you will. So you've got events, you've got commands, and you've got queries. Normally denoted, events are normally orange or yellow, commands are normally blue, queries are normally green. So there is some element of consistency when you do an event storm with the colors. And all we do straight off the bat is we forget about these just for the minute. I'm going to move them over there. And we the first thing we do, and if you imagine this is a room full of people, you literally go through and think of all of the events, all the things that happen. And there doesn't need to be any element of order here. There doesn't need to be anything structured. It is literally just throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. And I think actually, if we were to go back to the domain story, Scott, I think that could be actually a good place to work through that domain story to maybe start to tease out some of these events.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And because we've used this fancy Egon tool that you like, I can actually rewind it all the way back to the start because there's actually a flow that we can walk through, right?
So I wonder if you want to, obviously, we've got your screen on screen now. Do you want to work through the story and shout out any events that you see? And then I'll kind of grab them on my side, and then we can switch it back over and see where we get to.
Sweet. Sounds good. So the very first one here is that a user approaches us at a Datadog booth and they ask to print a particular sticker. So I guess there's probably an event there where, it's like a physical event in the real world. Maybe we want to capture it, maybe not. I'm interested in your opinion on this, but they're coming up to us and saying, I want to do this particular thing. They haven't touched a computer yet, though. I guess that's the interesting nuance here.
Yeah, I think this. I'm gonna put like user sticker requested or user sticker requested or something like that. We might, like you say, we might not need it, but this is something that happens in the real world, like you said. So I think it's worth capturing for sure.
After they've done that, they are apparently told by James and Scott that they should sign up for an account on the Stickerlandia web app. And that really feels like an event to me, that you sign up for an account at the very least, that you would emit some message saying, hey, there's a new user in the system.
Mm-hmm. So what we say in there, like user, there's probably an interesting thing actually here. If I just pull my screen back up just for a second, But like, this can be an interesting scenario where, let's say me and you were on different teams, and you might say, I don't know, a user signed up, and maybe I call it account created, and maybe another team calls it sticker Landia user requested. I don't know, whatever that is. And this can obviously be a point in contention, not so much for us because we're talking like net new, but if you think about an existing business, an existing piece of software, an existing domain that people understand, this will probably exist across the business, that there'll be these different words for things. And how you would typically handle that is you kind of just group all of them things together and kind of leave them just for the minute. Like by the end of this, you'd want to agree on what the right terminology is. But for now, you'd probably just leave all these together and say, hey, look, there's these things that we all have different ideas of users. Let's just leave that there and carry on through the rest of the process.
And I mean, that's super interesting in big old or businesses that have been around for a long time, right? Because people have very strong ideas about nomenclature for things.
Yeah.
And then you're in a position where you're trying to standardize it for the sake of doing an event model. And maybe there's kind of like an adjacent benefit to that, right? Like if everyone speaks in the same terminology internally, that's definitely
100%
desirable. Cool. So the other thing that kind of jumped out here to me is that there's another event that's not really there, which is that the user visits the Stickerlandia website. I don't know if that's the sort of thing you would capture as more of like an analytics perspective, but it's something that happens in this flow, right?
I'm going to put it in there again. We're just trying to capture. There's no real, generally when you do this, there's no real right or wrong. It is literally just capturing as much as possible. Maybe we find out after the fact that event is a thing that exists, but it isn't necessarily something that would map to a piece of functionality in the software, which then of course means that we can kind of just drop it and move it off to a holding page. Yeah. So I would tentatively assume you're right, that's probably more of like an analytical thing, but at this point, capture as much as possible and you can always delete afterwards.
Cool. Let me push a bit further through this rather than pushing at the bounds of event storming.
The people listening haven't got all day, Scott.
Nothing wrong with verbosity.
Cool. So if we jump back over to my screen then. So what I've been doing whilst you were doing that is basically just like writing down all the events that we've kind of talked about. And I've loosely kind of grouped some of these together. So we had a bit of conversation between us about decreased or changed. And we had assigned that was on its own. We had this group of ones related to users creation. And then we had, these other ones that were more clear. And the next thing you typically do at this point is once you've got all this list of events, you'd kind of put them in some element of time, temporal order. Yep. These things will happen in some kind of order, right? So we know that the website gets visited, then all these kind of loosely user-related ones would happen next. Then probably we think a sticker assigned, stock gets decreased, user requests a sticker printed, something like that if we go in time order. At this point, it's probably a good time to kind of agree what our wording, what our language is going to be for these various different things. Yeah, I completely agree. So again, if you're listening to this and you've got some big complicated domain that you're working, this probably looks a little bit simpler. If you were to do this yourself, I imagine in almost all cases your event storm would end up a bit more complicated than what we've got here. But this is what you kind of end up with. You end up with this shared common language about the events that happen in the business over some element of time-ish. And obviously you might have some things that happen like at the same time that can be fine. So the next thing that you would normally do on an event storm is, if I go and grab my commands and my queries, is that you then start to layer on the commands and the queries that would trigger these events to happen. So here for a user sticker requested, you would have request sticker, for example. And then you can kind of say, so for a user to be able to request a sticker, though, they need to be able to see the list of all the available stickers. So we're going to need a query here for our list available. James can't spell today. List available stickers. And what you kind of end up getting into is this kind of recurring set of this query that happens that call that the user can hit this query to then run this command, which will then trigger this event to happen.
And this is interesting because before, when we were looking at the domain storytelling board, there were a bunch of things where I waved my hands and said, nothing's changing here, so I don't care. But I think a lot of those actually end up being queries, right?
Exactly. This is actually the first time I've ever done a domain story immediately followed by an event storm. And actually, as you say, I can really see the benefit here of having that first really high level user flow, and then going through that user flow, saying what events would actually happen, and almost then proving out that your boundaries match up in the same way.
Yeah. I mean, there's always going to be an element of decomposing services more because you have lots of engineers. Like if you're building a system with one person, you're probably not going to decompose it into a million microservices.
Yeah.
As you apply more engineers, you start to look for finer and finer grained split lines, essentially. But I think there's still kind of natural splits for your domain context, and this seems like a very effective way of identifying that.
Yeah, and that's just to reiterate again what I said before, like what we've ended up with here, although we've started to layer on these boundaries, we did that in the domain story as well. We like layered the domains on top. You saw that in Scott's little screenshot earlier. This still doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to build microservices, right? Like these could be modules inside a monolithic application. There's still value in doing this to understand the things that happen, to get a shared language across your different teams, across your business, and then to, as you've just said, kind of verify that the boundaries you expect are still the same after you've added this other layer of upfront design.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that we just with saying upfront design, then obviously there's the whole don't do waterfall approach thing. And I think having this domain story and having this event storm, for me at least now, I would feel comfortable at this point, and I'm interested to see if you feel the same. I'd feel comfortable with what we know about the domain story, what we will be done with this really simplistic event storm, to actually start thinking about actually architecting more technically now, going that layer deeper.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. We could go down to the next level and say, notion that you own these bounded contexts, I own these ones. Let's write some API specs and see where we land.
Let's do it. Sounds like there's a next video right there. Yeah, ship it. So just to go back over what we've covered today then. So we've covered the idea of event storming. So we had that domain story that we put together in the first video that really at a really high level walk through the user journeys for one such journey through the system. We've then almost, I don't know if I'd consider it a layer deeper, but we've gone to another layer of upfront design where we've started to think about all the events, all the business events, all the commands that would trigger them events, all the queries that a user would need to have to be able to make a command in the first place. And we've mapped all that out over time. So we can now see that we've got all these events, all these queries, all these commands, and we can use that, then them two artifacts we've got now to, as Scott has just quite rightly said, to maybe go a layer deeper and actually start thinking about specs. And that's what we'll cover in the next video in this series on modern software engineering, is how you can start to think about the integration points between your systems, how you can design those so that you can allow people to go off and work completely independently, with the theory being that we can just stick all these systems back together afterwards and everything will just work, he says nervously.
And then after that, we can do some code and start to talk about technology. Imagine that.
We're getting there. If you're watching this and you want to see some code and you want to see some architecting, you want to see some building, then it's coming, we promise.